General Dempsey, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Chapel Hill. You were President Obama's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff between 2011 and 2015, important position. I'm wondering, when you look back at that, towards that time and compare it with our present days, what would you say has changed? Have things become really more volatile, more dangerous, or are there great similarities?
Well, that's a question that's roundly debated in academia in particular, whether the world is more dangerous today than it was. And as you know, there's several leading spokesmen who make a pretty persuasive case that the death rate across the globe is well down from the high points of the middle of the last century. On the other hand, I think we'd have to concede that the world is both more complex with the introduction of let's call it the reintroduction, actually, of near-peer competitors. You know, the path ahead with Russia and China is unclear. We have two nations in Iran and North Korea which are destabilizing not only for the regions in which they reside, but for the rest of the world. And we've got a 50-year potentially problem looming with these radical Islamist groups who pervert Islam in the name of, and with the instrument of terror. So that stretches from Afghanistan to Nigeria. So, you know, beginning in about 2014, these things began to converge in ways that they hadn't converged in probably the previous 25 years. So I felt as though the world was becoming both more complex and more dangerous in that environment.
Thank you. There's a lot of discussion in the media about the American defense budget, but some people also say the American military has actually become a lot weaker, isn't as strong as it used to be. But when you look at the Pentagon's budget, it's huge. So you wonder, how can that be? What is it actually? Do we still have a very strong American military, or has the American military really become a fairly weak instrument?
No, we have a very strong military, but that's not to say it doesn't have. It's not fragile in certain ways. And the inability of the Congress to pass a budget has been probably our most serious problem, because it prevents us from investing in the way we need to in everything from modernization to readiness. We also have our hands tied a bit in infrastructure. You know, we have 20% of the military's infrastructure is excess to need. If we could shed some unnecessary infrastructure, close some base camps and stations, we'd have money to invest elsewhere. So the size of the budget is only part of the issue. It's how much flexibility we have or don't have in how to use it. And the two places notably where we need more flexibility is in infrastructure and in weapons systems. When we're told to keep a weapon system beyond its useful, necessary life, it's just money that we would be able to invest elsewhere. So we really need budget certainty, which is to say a budget, you know, passed in a timely fashion. And we need flexibility. And with that, I think the military will be able to continue to sustain its dominance in nearly every area.
Thank you. Transatlantic relations have become quite fragile and much more tense than they used to be under the Obama presidency. What are we going to do about it? Or do we just let it continue in that kind of downward spiral for forever?
Well, you know, look, Klaus, I think when you look at the changes of leadership in the countries in Europe over time, you know, we went through a rather significant change of leadership in Europe, a rather significant change of leadership in France. And in those years, our relationships with, in particular, England and France kind of waxed and waned. It's never a steady, it's never a straight line. And so it's not surprising to me that the relationship would be changed in some ways, I think, negatively, and in some cases it could be positively. But I think that truthfully, in particular, our European allies expect a certain amount of change. Now, the amount of change they expected might be more than they bargained for, if you will, with the change from President Obama to President Trump. But none of us are unfamiliar with change. I think, and in particular in this first year, I think that we'll see over time whether the sine wave of change is deep or whether it begins to level off. And what would cause it to level off is a greater appreciation for the shared challenges we face and the fact that it's prohibitively expensive to try to do it yourself.
But don't you think that the transatlantic identity, the common values the transatlantic alliance has been based on since the 1950s have been weakened? At least that seems to be the impression of the European allies, that they feel it's not just a matter of faces, but really there is something much more fundamental at work, that the United States doesn't seem to be as close to the old transatlantic values as they were in the 1950s and 1960s. Do you think that European impression is not justified?
I wouldn't say it's not justified. I can only say that it is not something that I sensed in the relationship among the militaries. So I sat as a member of the military committee of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and I never sensed that they doubted in any way our commitment to collective security, which is really the most important thing. I'm sure that there's other areas where some may be more outspoken than others about a deteriorating relationship. My prediction, though, is that the relationship will be bent, never broken, and it will recover as quickly as it feels as though it may have bent. I just think it's too solid and too necessary for it to be permanently damaged.
Okay, I like your optimism.
Yeah.
When you look at the world at large, beyond Europe and transatlantic relations, it's really Russia and China which feature very large, and both are seen as rivals and possible enemies and foes of the United States. How do you judge that? Is there a relationship which will be hostile and inimical for quite some time? Can you do something about getting it into more constructive waters?
Well, we should. I mean, I always reminded everyone that the military's principal responsibility is to deter war, and then secondly, if deterrence fails, to actually fight a war. But as you've heard me say many times, war is the most unpredictable of human endeavors, and so it is certainly incumbent on all of us to continue to try to understand the issues that each of us face, find as much commonality as we possibly can, recognizing there are just certain things we cannot and should not tolerate, violations of sovereignty, violations of the treaties that exist, that we have, that could be impacted as China expands into the South China Sea and as Russia expands into Eastern Europe. Interference in elections certainly rises to that level for me. Attacks on U.S. Critical infrastructure, businesses, through cyber means by certain actors. So, look, there are plenty of places where we have reason to be cooperative, like counter-terrorism, counter-narcotics, natural disaster relief, and things of that nature. But there are places where we have some serious problems. And in those areas, we have to be very careful that it doesn't spiral out of control. But nor should we allow ourselves to just persuade ourselves that you can, we have to be careful of relativism. We let things go this far. Well, if we let it go that far, maybe a little further than that, and all of a sudden then we have a problem. I think we identify those areas where we aren't going to be subject to relativism and hold our ground.
So war with China isn't inevitable?
No.
Some authors have argued.
No, not inevitable. Frankly, I'm of a mind that war with China is as inconceivable to them as it is to us. And that doesn't mean there couldn't be an isolated flare-up, even including the loss of life. But it seems to me that rational, responsible leadership could help us overcome that and prevent it from leading to a much wider conflict, which is in no one's interest.
Thank you. A couple of more questions. The war on terrorism, as it used to be called, has it been won largely?
Well, I think you have to define winning, right? I mean, when you're talking about limited war for limited objectives, as opposed to general war for survival, when you talk about limited war, it's always a little tricky to identify what a win looks like, what success looks like, what progress looks like. From my way of looking at it, we've accomplished what we set out to accomplish in the war on terror Meaning we've reduced safe havens, we continue to maintain pressure on networks and leaders who would seek to harm our allies and partners and ourselves, the homeland. So we've largely succeeded in keeping that kind of pressure on. The challenge we've got with these radical ideological groups is that they can often move from being a group to a movement. You know, so you have a single group, it becomes a movement when it is accepted by others who are like-minded. And then, you're familiar with the term meme, we see some of these ideologies becoming more like a meme, and they move at the speed of memes, which is they move from individual to individual. The ideology moves from person to person, not from institution to individual. In that environment, you have to concede that you're into a very long process of not only defeating those who would physically do you harm, but you've got to counter the ideology. And I think the problem in the Mideast and North Africa is their societies are so fragile, failing, that they can't counter the ideology, and they're going to need some stability to do that, which means we're into this for a long time. Doesn't mean we have to fight it by ourselves, doesn't mean we have to, in fact, shouldn't fight it with large numbers, but we have to have a 20-year outlook on this and not be guilty of having 21-year campaigns. We need one 20-year campaign.
When you passed on the position of chairman to your successor, what were the lessons you gave your successor, the advice? What was most important, what you learned, what you experienced during your time as chairman?
Well, I told him that he had to keep learning, that whatever conceptions or notions he had coming in, they were going to change, and I'm sure they did when we went from one president to the next. Secondly, that he needed to carve out time for himself in the cacophony and the freneticism of the interagency process. He needed to carve out time for himself to keep learning, even about things that didn't seem to have an immediate military implication, like, you know, climate change or epidemics, because all of those eventually end up being partly military problems. I told him that he had to build relationships inside of the White House. We only get things done, and in the Secretary of Defense's office, the department, you only get done in Washington that which you can get done through relationships. It's as simple as that. And then I mentioned to him and hope, and I think that he has taken this on, that he was responsible not just for the conduct of our military operations, but for the health of our profession, for making sure that the 1.2 million men and women in uniform felt both the burden and the blessing of being part of something bigger than themselves with an ethos that we were all responsible for sustaining, and the relationship with the American people. So that was my advice, and as far as I can tell, he's doing exactly that.
Very good. General Dempsey, thank you very much for coming and visiting UNC-Chapel Hill today and for talking to us in our 5-minute Insight series.
My pleasure, very much. Klaus, keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Thanks.